When it's time for your number to come up, it doesn't matter where the dice land. Back in 18, I was working with a mercenary company called Force 7, a mixed regiment under a long-term contract with Haus Steiner. Force 7 was a light, mobile unit, mostly mechs under 45 tons, backed by jump infantry with a few aerospace fighters for cover. We specialised in quick raids and recoveries, and as the Third Succession War was winding down, we saw a lot of action. The Lyrans were trying to keep the snakes off balance, and Force 7 was doing a lot of hit and run beyond the border into Curitan space. In a 10-month period, we averaged at least one action every 3.5 weeks. We stayed on the run, trying to stay downside for no more than a few hours. We kept supplied using parts that we liberated from Curitan mechs and sent back a steady stream of intel to keep the bosses happy. But even we couldn't maintain that pace, and it ended on Dis. You may not have heard of Dis unless you make a hobby of stellar navigation. Dis is a white dwarf about 30 light years into Curitan space. The system has no habitable planets and marginal metal resources. The system gas giants have lost most of the valuable complex and their long-chain compounds due to the star's heavy radiation output. In all, a waste system except that by some quirk of astrophysics, Dis emits a focused spectrum of EM, most of which falls right in the sweet spot for recharging jump ship sails. A lot of commerce passes through Dis, and so do a lot of troops. As 18 was winding down, Force 7 got linked with a number of other Steiner units into a raid on Dis. The brass was looking for intel on troop movements along the border and wanted to disrupt any incoming attacks. Dis was a prime target. Our job was to take a data center on an in-system moon that served as the main traffic control. The brass wanted us to retrieve the data core while their naval units dealt with the massive dry docks and ship facilities in orbit near the star. The order of battle called for us to be in-system for only 3 days. Then we'd evac before reinforcements arrived. After this run, we were to be rotated back from the front to refit and relax for at least 4 months. Spirits were running high as we headed for our last mission in this string, and as always we found time to unwind between mission briefings, simulation runs and weapon checks, and, as with armies throughout the centuries, we spent most of our free time talking about the upcoming mission and gambling. I've always been a dice fan, preferring the feel of the cubes in my hand over cards or electronics. As we were preparing for our final jump to Dis, the 3 other members of my lance were clustered at the foot of my mech, Steel Goblin, a venerable phoenix hawk if I do say so myself. Besides myself, the game consisted of my lance mates, Turk, the taciturn Jenner pilot, Tompkins, who piloted a rattletrap Whitworth, and Descartes, who fought in a jet-black Clint called Viper. An ever-changing number of personnel from other units drifted through the game, but we formed the Nexus. As the dice passed and the sea bills flowed, we discussed the upcoming battle. Turk said little, but that wasn't a surprise. Tompkins thought this might be our chance to break into the big league, getting an offer from one of the big units. I withheld judgment, and Descartes said it didn't matter. We were warriors, meant to fight and die whenever and wherever fate decreed. As she picked up the dice for her next throw, she paused to stare at the hard-impact plastic and said, "If only these could show our fate, then at least we'd know." She rattled them in her fist and threw out across the rectangle of worn green felt, my mech towering above her like the image of some god hewn from blue-grey metal. After the dice spun, a single spot showed on each cube. "Snake eyes," someone said. At that moment the warning klaxon went off and we had to scramble for our mechs. The transport was jumping in system to Dis, putting us only 3 hours of heavy burn from our target. Orders were for Force 7 to spend the transit time in our mechs, ready to unload once we hit dirt side. As we webbed in, I kept thinking about those dice, bouncing off a goblin's foot and stopping on the green cloth. We jumped into a hornet's nest. Over a dozen Kurita warships were in system as we arrived. A blind mud dog could have seen that a major invasion was forming and we should cut and run instantly, coming back with a heavier force of our own. But the commander of the operation said, "Go!" So we did, and spent hours under heavy G acceleration to reach our target. When we did, we ran into our own personal hell. We were outnumbered 2-1, by heavier machines. Tompkins Whitworth bought it within minutes of landing. I called for an evac moments later, and it was time to get out, no matter what fate decreed. Descartes and I wound up covering the retreat, her Viper and the Steel Goblin pouring volleys of fire into the oncoming Kurita units, while our teammates rushed for the dropships. With only 4 minutes to spare, we ran for the last dropship, trying to cover our own retreat until we got under the ship's guns. It happened in the last 100 meters, I think. I just let fly with full barrage from behind a twisted rock formation and confirmed that Descartes was ready to head for cover. We were going to jump for it, trying to land as close to the cargo hatch as we could. Flashing lights marked safety, blazing through the clouds of blowing dust and ammonia wind. The ground vibrated with the hum of the revving dropship engines, and we were the last. I saw the indicators on my command screen burn green, showing Goblin's jets were ready to go. Then a stab of red light caught Descartes in the face. I saw her stagger, a jet of white vapour exploding from the hole burned in the right screen of the head. We were all on supplied air, so I knew she wouldn't die from the atmosphere, but by the angle, I felt sure the laser bolt must have burned right through her chair. But Viper was still moving, so I slipped Goblin's left arm around the wounded mech and staggered for the dropship, firing wildly on my heavy laser to keep the snakes at bay. We made it into the dropship and instantly were slammed by the pull of acceleration as the ship clawed its way free of the killing ground. I was screaming over the comlink to get an emergency medtech and salvage crew down to help pull a pilot out of a damaged cockpit, but of course we couldn't do anything for hours. The Lyrans were in full retreat across the system, and if we didn't make our jump ship in time, we'd be left behind. We made it, and as soon as we dropped from full burn, I was out of my mech. I blew the emergency bolts on her cockpit. The stench of fused metal and scorched flesh greeted me. Coughing, I pulled her out. She was still alive, though all of her exposed skin was flash burned. Once she was in the hands of the medtechs, I went back to look at the cockpit. Sometimes you'll hear someone say, "It's a miracle they survived." Well, I've seen the real thing. The interior of the cockpit was painted with globs of armoured glass, sprayed when the laser had burnt through the viewport. The bolt had hit the command couch, slagging the lower right third of the entire structure before pitting the back of the head armour. Descartes must have been bent over away from the blast, and her environmental armour absorbed the brunt of the blast. Still to this day, I've never seen anyone survive a near miss from a vehicle laser. As I left the cargo bay, I looked back at Viper, sprawled across the deck, tech swarming across its pitted body. The cockpit was toward me, the right side up, exposing the laser hole. I remember thinking how much it looked like a single eye. On the trip back, Descartes spent most of her time by herself. Turk and I didn't force our company on her, we were all mourning Tompkins' death, and no one had much of a hunger for the game of chance. In total, Force 7 had lost 34% of its combat personnel. We retreated to Stanyan's World, a small agricultural planet about as far away from the Marek-Kurita borders as you can get. We set up shop and began the slow process of refit. The CO headed for more populated systems, trying to get replacement troops to rebuild the unit for fighting strength. As the top-ranking surviving officer after the CO, the task of overseeing the repairs would fall to me. I did the best job I could and tried to pull Descartes out of her funk, but my help wasn't needed on that front. It took about 10 days to get the mechs back into something resembling fighting shape. The local garrison commander obliged us with what she had, but like Stanyan's World itself, the parts on hand were what you'd expect in a backwater. This meant lots of fabrication overtime for the service techs. That was okay, because the only sizable town on the planet had just enough bars for the locals. I got in several games, and the dice were good to me then. Descartes turned down my invitations to join, though. My mech was about back together, and word had come down that Force 7 was going to assemble for the next mission. That's when the raid hit us from out of nowhere. The attack came in from the north side of town. It wasn't a disciplined military unit, just a mob of bandits, about half a dozen mechs, lots of skimmers full of mean, over-equipped infantry. They must not have known that Force 7 was on Stanyan's World, or if they did know, they must have thought we were still crippled from the fighting at Dis. The leader pulled his entire force up in a long line and demanded the surrender of the place. The garrison commander told him straight to drop dead. This was too bad. Another minute and I'd have had my lance in a perfect position to rake their entire line. The bandits opened fire and the local troops dodged into the town. Just then my lance got them in view. Turk fired first without orders. The enemy mech took the big one full side. Descartes fired at the next mech in the line. As the autocannon hits made pockmarks on the side of the target, the attackers raced to distance themselves from us by scattering into the town. A brutal street-to-street battle evolved, with Force 7 and local garrison troops stalking raiders amongst the buildings. Descartes and I paired off again as Turk led another light lance, and between Steel Goblin and Viper's firepower, nothing the raiders had could stand against us. We ripped through them like PPC through aluminium plate. Descartes was in prime form. She piloted that Clint like a master, ripping through opponents with her AC and twin lasers. She seemed unstoppable, racking up kill after kill while I struggled to keep pace. Steel Goblin took a solid leg hit in the retreat back at Dis, and though the artificial joints all seemed fine, I kept detecting a limp in the right side. Guess that's why I was nearly 100 meters behind her when Descartes rounded that industrial complex. The bandit mech was a patchwork monstrosity. The legs were salvaged from a Wolverine, and I recognised the left arm from an Enforcer, complete with large laser. The rest was a jumble of welded parts that must have come from a dozen salvaged mechs. Descartes fired first, Viper's autocannon soaring the air as the twin lasers flashed out. The bandit took 3 solid hits and staggered under the assault, chips of ceramic armour and sheet metal blowing back. The infrared showed Viper a spike yellow as the heat sinks fought to dump the sudden surge that her weapons produced. I snapped off a laser as well. The beam missed high, flashing off into the distance, and as I flew, both mechs fired again. Descartes gave it everything she had. She never was one for half measure. The bandit took all 3 hits again, losing the right arm in the process. As it fell, a swarm of SRMs erupted from its polyglot torso and slammed into the ground beside her. Smoke poured from the missile ports, and I knew an internal fire was raging through the core of the machine. But as the bandit crashed into the pavement, the left arm laser fired. It should have been a blind shot, like mine blazing off into the distance. But it wasn't. The beam caught her on the left side of the head, square in the viewport. I hit the ground and instinctively triggered a barrage of laser fire into the mech. I needn't have bothered, it was coming apart at the seams as the ammo blew. I turned to Descartes and saw the hole burn through the armoured glass plate across the left viewport. Congealed glass weeping like frozen tears from a single eye. Viper swayed, then toppled backwards. Without thinking, I dropped Goblin to her knees and shut down, not even bothering to remove my helmet in my rush to get out. Yes, it was stupid. In the middle of a war zone, I abandoned functioning mechs. I should have called for backup or tried to tie into Viper's onboard systems. I didn't. Something just compelled me to race to her aid. I blew the bolts on the escape hatch, a horrible sense of deja vu blotting my senses. The same slagged metal and scorched plastic smell assailed me, and it was mixed with the stench of charred meat. Descartes was dead, still strapped into a chair, most of her chest vaporized by the laser. Hanging from the center viewport was a good luck charm, the crystal dice, each of their 6 faces marked with a single pip. From the diary of Captain Martha K. Stanchek, retired. Well, that's another short story. I know some people have been looking for a new short story for a while, and I've been going through, and Snake Eyes seemed like an interesting one. A little small unit, just small combat action, bit different. So, yeah, there you go. Hope you enjoyed that. I'll get to recording some more of these over time. But, yeah, have a good one all. Thanks again for listening. Bye-bye.